What's up, my AP students? Hope everybody is doing well. Just wanted to do a quick rundown of essential questions in each unit. I know we looked at some material stuff on Monday that's more content-based, but this is more just overarching ideas from each unit and what the important questions are. This should really help you with the LEQ and SAQ stuff as we go through it in your midterm. So for Unit 1, how did the Columbian Exchange basically affect each side of it? So the Old World in Europe, sending over smallpox to North America is obviously going to wipe out like 90% of the native population. So that's the really big thing. From the New World in North America to Europe, we have mostly crops coming across. These things are like tobacco, cotton, and sugar. Because of how labor intensive these crops are, it eventually leads to like the rise of African slavery. We try things like Native Americans working, but they're going to die mostly from disease. And then you try indentured servitude, which eventually fails with like Bacon's Rebellion, and it shows that it doesn't work. So they're going to have to rely on African labor. That question comes up in Unit 2 as well. How did Native Americans essentially change from before the Europeans showed up to afterwards? We talked about this where the original people in North America crossed the land bridge from Russia to North America. And once they're here, they do establish like tribes and stuff, and they do have tribal warfare, but definitely the lives of the Native Americans get way worse when the Europeans show up. Part of the Columbian Exchange as well is getting things like guns and technology over here, which is really going to change Native Americans' lifestyles. Much more difficult to hunt a buffalo with a bow and arrow like we've talked about before while running. You know, it's easier using a gun on a horse, which they're going to get from Europe. So that's part of the Columbian Exchange as well. But basically, the lives of the Native Americans get appreciably worse after the white Europeans show up, even though there is new technology. Unit 2, our second unit, were the major similarities and differences between the Europeans that came over to colonize America. We'll start with England. England mostly colonizes the eastern seaboard of the U.S., where you think of like New England to like the mid-Atlantic to some of the southern colonies today. They're big on economics and establishing like trade colonies like Jamestown. While they're here, they're, again, looking mostly for money, but a lot of the people that came over from England are seeking religious freedom as well, religious tolerance, like the Puritans in Massachusetts. That is compared to the other European groups, specifically the Spanish, who are mostly coming over here not only for like gold and stuff, which they totally are, but also to convert the native populations to Christianity. We looked at somebody like Las Casas, who actually supports the Native Americans and says they're much more, not savages than what Europeans think they are. So basically the difference is in that. And then you have the French and the Dutch as well, who are less significant. The French also coming over here for economic reasons, mostly for fur trade, and the Dutch for economic reasons as well. Remember, they take over New York City at first. It's called New Amsterdam until the British kick them out. So the Dutch aren't here very long, but also looking for economics, right? How did the slavery system develop in North America? We talked about this too. Because of how labor intensive cotton, sugar, and tobacco are, we're going to need high slave labor to keep that going, especially, again, once the Native American populations are wiped out and indentured servitude fails. In what ways did the British government seek to exert control over the American colonies? We talked about salutary neglect and basically the idea that the English had left the Americans, the North Americans, their colonies, to their own devices, which is going to give America like this sort of sense of freedom. It's not until basically right before the French and Indian War that the British are going to start exerting more control over their North American colonies, like that proclamation line that doesn't let them go past the Appalachian Mountains. They're going to start exerting more control, and it's basically like telling a teenager you just gave them a driver's license, and they're like, hey, actually, you can't drive to this place, this place, this place, and this place. Of course, they're not going to listen to you. They want to be independent. So the British ending salutary neglect is a major cause of the American Revolution, but also American and national identity in the sense that they let us develop ourselves. Unit 3, how did different social groups' identities evolve during the revolutionary struggle? How did leaders of the new United States attempt to form a national identity? We looked at things like the Declaration of Independence, obviously, but things like Common Sense by Thomas Paine, showing like rationalism through the Enlightenment is really the big idea here. You can be your own person. You can make your own decisions. And that's going to, obviously social groups develop here, where you only have like 2% of the population able to vote, even in like early America, just post-revolution. You still have massively high slave population. populations, and clearly women and immigrants are not being treated well either. So you do have like a small group of landowning whites that have independence and freedom during the American and after the American Revolution, but that's pretty much it. How did the ideology behind the revolution affect the power relationships between these groups? Well, remember, people are going to start questioning their place in society a lot because of Enlightenment. They're not going to simply listen to authority because it's authority. They can think for themselves and make decisions based on themselves. So you're setting up this mindset for all of America through the rest of the history for people to fight for equality. Not only those white land-owning males who control most of the money and power in the country at the time, or all of the money and all the power. But by writing down things in the Declaration of Independence, like everybody's created equal, endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, we the people of the United States. When you set up a government like that, clearly people are eventually going to demand those rights, which is going to be a really easy thing to trace through most of our country's history. Remember things like the Articles of Confederation and how we had to change those, and the different compromises that actually lead to the Constitution. Things like the Three-Fifths Compromise, things like the Electoral College, things like the Virginia Plan and the New Jersey Plan coming together in the Connecticut Compromise. Why did the Patriot cause spread so quickly among the colonists? Remember, basically, England is going to force us to pay for the French and Indian War. It's not really the taxation part of it that's going to bother us. It's the no representation part of it that's going to bother us. So it spread so quickly because the English are going to levy taxes on us. And then you also have, again, influential works like Common Sense, and then actions by the British like the Boston Massacre and the Boston Tea Party that are going to eventually inspire Americans to sort of join this revolutionary cause. Unit 4. How did the growth of mass manufacturing in the North, right, basically affect relationships throughout the entire country? Remember, we had said in the Market Revolution, which is the big thing in Unit 4, this all gets set up by Alexander Hamilton and the strong federalist idea of the government having like a Bank of the United States and being able to consolidate debt in the federal government, which frees up the states and individuals to grow economically. So the Market Revolution is going to connect the country together in this economic sense, which is important because basically we're going to get divided up by slavery here at the end. The issue of slavery is going to cause the Civil War. But Unit 4 and the Market Revolution is really the country getting connected together. Things like the Erie Canal, things like national railroads, things like the telegraph, even things I know at the beginning of Unit 5, like Manifest Destiny. This is going to allow people to actually move out west and sort of settle that area because they now have the technology to do so, unlike the Oregon Trail and such. But yeah, so mass manufacturing is also going to lead to like social life. We talked about the difference between private and public life, the roles of women in society, and basically your standard like 5-day week, 8 hours a day. No, it's not really that yet, but it's going to, the idea of like going to work is going to develop in this time period too, which is a really big deal. How did the growth of ideals of mass democracy affect America? So basically, this is an Andrew Jackson question. Universal white male suffrage under Jackson is a big deal. A common AP question is basically like, how did people gain rights over time? That's a big one that people usually miss. They'll talk about like women getting the right to vote in 1920. They'll talk about Black America getting the right to vote. But they usually miss universal white suffrage, which happens under Andrew Jackson or right before he gets elected president. We looked at all the differences, all the nuances of Jackson and all the little stuff too, which you can look at on your own, but he's a really interesting and important guy. Remember his economic policies, which like get rid of the Bank of the United States, do lead to economic failure eventually. And then Unit 5, lastly, we talk a lot about immigration. Basically, as America becomes more economically prosperous, we're able to support more immigrants in the country. We have a lot of immigrants coming from China, specifically to make the Transcontinental Railroad. We have immigrants coming from Europe, obviously, as well. And then forced immigration, too, with slavery, which is still around, coming in from Africa. Before that, obviously the slave trade is over, but you know what I mean. How America treats immigrants when they get here is basically the way we treat immigrants through our entire country's history. Not well, even though everybody is an immigrant in this country, unless you're Native American. Setting up policies like the Know Nothing Party, if we know nothing about them, it's that they hate Irish Catholics. There's going to be a lot of racial and hate for immigrants in the country in general. people moving to different areas as well. Remember, most immigrants move out to the West just because of opportunity and stuff. How did Manifest Destiny affect debates over territorial expansion? Things like the Monroe Doctrine, which is a little earlier in like Unit 4, the idea that the United States controls our entire hemisphere and that Manifest Destiny is our God-given right to take over the entire continent. Does lead to things like the Oregon Crisis, 5440-year fight with my boy James K. Polk, the Webster-Ashburton Treaty in Maine, and a whole bunch of different stuff like the Mexican-American War, too, where America is going to expand itself outward. And basically the debate over that is how much power does the federal government have? When you look back at things like the Louisiana Purchase, the big deal was that Thomas Jefferson basically didn't have the constitutional authority to do something like that. And as time goes on in American history, the federal government's going to get more power, specifically the role of the presidency. And this really does start with things like Manifest Destiny and taking over different parts of the land to get from like sea to signing sea. Last question, why did attempts and compromises before the Civil War fail to prevent war? We looked at like the Compromise of 1820, also known as the Missouri Compromise, where, Missouri comes in as a slave state, Maine is free state. We looked at the Compromise of 1850. We looked all the way back at like the Three-Fifths Compromise. We looked at like popular sovereignty in Bleeding Kansas. Basically, the issue is that the South is so reliant economically on slavery and culturally reliant on slavery. It's like so ingrained in their head they can't get rid of it. So none of these compromises are actually going to work. Remember, the big deal in the 1851 was the Fugitive Slave Act and how that basically forces Northerners to like follow Southern way of life, and they don't like that. After the war, 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments and Reconstruction. We know Reconstruction fails because the Union was basically forcing the South to follow the new Reconstruction laws, 13 ending slavery, 14 equal protection under the law, and 15 black male rights to vote. They were only following these things because the North was holding guns to their head. Once they leave in the Compromise of 1877, which is going to give Rutherford B. Hayes the presidency in exchange for the Union leaving the South. That's where Reconstruction really fails. So these are just some overarching ideas and things to keep in your head as you move forward. Don't forget groups like women, groups like immigrants, groups like slaves, and then now freed slaves are big focuses for AP as well. So you may want to deep dive those groups, specifically women. Wink, wink. That's like your help. One of your SAQ questions is about women in the American Revolution. Thanks for watching the video. See ya.